to the Entertainah Talkin Sports.
What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. And in this video, I'm going to jump into the news today that came out about Nate Solder. Of course, the left tackle, who would be a right tackle if he was back with the New York Giants next year, at least in my opinion, that the New York Giants signed, formerly of the New England Patriots, to a record-breaking deal the first year that Dave Gettleman took the job with the New York Giants. Turned out to be a horrible signing. I think most people understood why we did it when we did. We had a decimated offensive line, and we were trying to repair it the best that we could. Nate Solder was the best tackle out on the open market and performed very well with the New England Patriots. Of course, the Patriots have very good coaching. Came over here with Pat Shurmur as his head coach, Hal Hunter, the offensive line coach, and things didn't really work out. In his first year, the first 8 games, it was abysmal. The second 8 games, he actually played really well. Some people do forget that. I'm going to give him credit for that. I don't think he surrendered a sack over his second 8 games his first year with the Giants. The next year, he was horrible. I think he surrendered 9 sacks. Now, of course, there were factors to that. You know, things came out after the fact that he had a very sick child at home, which is why he sat out this year. Not to mention, one thing that I think you have, if you're being fair, you have to take into account, he was dealing with a rookie quarterback. Daniel Jones, we all know, wasn't the best at reading opposing defenses, but Solder was to blame for at least a large portion of the sacks that he gave up, even though Jones at times probably held the ball too long in the pocket, maybe didn't make the best pre-snap reads. Jones now going into his third year, you would think would be better in that aspect. Now, of course, Solder, if he were to be back, would have to play on the right side, and he's been out of football for a year, being that he held out last year. A lot of people thought he'd be back last year because I think he was due $19 million, and it would have cost us $16 to cut him, so it would have only been $3 million in savings. But because he sat out last year, we still have to pay him 5 of the 16 or 5.5, and we're due 10.5 this year. And we're going to get into the exact contract details, but most Giant fans just assumed he would either retire, being that he's 33 years old, he sat out a year, his kids are sick, or if he didn't, the New York Giants would cut him and he'd play somewhere else, which very well still may be the case. Of course, there was news that broke right after the fact from Ian Rappaport. I'm going to pull up the tweet that the New York Giants are potentially looking to restructure his contract. And I'm going to get into why, even though you may want him cut no matter what, it could make financial sense for the New York Giants if they go that route, if it's for the right deal. And I'm going to give you my full explanation as to why, in the right circumstance, I wouldn't be against that. If not, though, and it's not the right circumstance, they need to cut this guy and they got to move on. And because for the simple reason that we don't, the cap is small as is. We need to get as many dollars as we possibly can. And Solder's not in the long-term plans at this point with the New York Giants. Of course, they drafted Matt Parrott last year. Matt Parrott's not a guy, though, that I think you could definitively depend on going into next year. And if the Giants restructure this deal, I think they're telling you that. The guy was the 99th overall pick for a reason. He was a project, a guy with a lot of potential, but the New York Giants may feel like he's not ready to be given the reins. And the other thing I'll say is if Solder were to be back, that doesn't mean he's definitively the starter. Probably would be going in if he was willing to play on the right side. But if he doesn't play well, I'm sure that they would insert Parrott into the lineup. But let's jump into the news of the day about Nate Solder, and then I'll get into why it could potentially make financial sense if they were able to restructure the contract. This first, the news from Jordan Renan of ESPN. Giants' Nate Solder intends to play in 2021 after the opt-out. Then in his article, he went on to talk about it. This then came out from Ian Rappaport about an hour and a half later. The Giants are expected to approach Nate Solder about restructuring his contract. That will likely determine which way this goes. And of course, Twitter reacted naturally, like you would think most New York Giants fans would react, being that a lot of them want him off the team because of his poor play and because of the money that we would save in doing it. One common thing that a lot of people talk about is if we cut him after June 1st, and I probably should have said this more so in my videos, you'd save $10 million against the cap, and it's only a $6.5 million dead cap as opposed to $10.5, which is entirely true. For this year, you would save $10 million against the salary cap. Now, there's a couple of caveats to that. The first thing I'll say, if you wait till June 1st, most of the top free agents are off the board. Agreed? Because March 17th, that's when free agency starts. That's when the heavy hitters generally sign. So if you wait till June 1st, you're going to be picking from the back of the litter. Now, you could argue that you may be able to find a suitable swing tackle that could compete with Matt Parrott for $5 or $6 million a year. Very possible at that point in time. The other thing I'll say, though, we are still on the books for the $10.5 million. Just because you do it after June 1st, that $4 million that you saved just becomes a dead cap hit in 2022. So regardless, no matter how you slice it, the New York Giants owe Nate Solder $10.5 million no matter what, if they cut him. No matter what, They're going to have to pay him that $10.5 million. So, how could it make sense for the New York Giants to potentially be interested in extending him? Well, I'm going to tell you what. Over the next 2 years, the New York Giants are due to pay Nate Solder $35.5 million. If they then go to Nate Solder and say, Nate, at this point in your career, you sat out, you haven't played, if we're being honest with each other, you haven't lived up to that contract. We know if we cut you, we got to pay you the $10.5. But more than likely, Nate, you're probably going to get a one-year deal similar to what Cam Fleming did if at the open market. Maybe you'll get $6 or $7 million, but no guarantee after that. Nate, what we're going to do for you, we're going to pay you the $35 or $36 million that we owe you, but we're going to do it over 3 years, and we're going to structure it in a way where we could get out after 2 without taking a dead cap hit or very little dead cap hit in the 3rd year. The 1st year, you set it up in a way to fit the salary cap. If it's $36 million over 3 years, you pay him $10 this year. So if you pay him $10 this year as opposed to the, I think it was $16.5 that he was due, let's just make sure while I talk about this. Yes, he was due $16.5 million. You're still saving that $6 million. I think it would have been $6 million you would have saved. You're still saving $6.5 million if you structure it that way. Then you pay him $12 in the 2nd, and then you're able to cut him in the 3rd. So it's essentially a 2-year contract in which you pay him $22 million. Instead of paying him the $10.5, you still have the same savings on this year's cap. And if you want to say, well, if you wait till June 1st, you save 10 instead of 6, sure. But then you'd have to spend that extra $4 or $5 million to get a suitable backup tackle that could compete with Matt Parrott anyway. So the way I look at it is this. If the Giants feel that Solder's at least comparable to a guy like Cam Fleming, I think it makes sense under the right circumstances to try to work out a restructure. That doesn't mean that Solder's going to be the starting right tackle all year. That doesn't mean that he's even going to get the job out of camp. But the fact of the matter is you're trying to make a bad situation better. And if you let him go, you're going to have to fill that vacancy in free agency anyway, or the draft, whatever it may be. If they feel like Parrott is not completely ready to be the everyday starter, I don't see that big of a deal if you're able to get a contract in like that, where you kind of spread out the money that you owe him, and you take basically the same hit that you would have anyway. That's the way I look at it. I think a restructure in that scenario could make a world of sense, and we're going to have to wait and see the dollar and cents if they work this out. Of course, if Nate Solder's not willing to cooperate, he's not willing to negotiate, and he wants to see what he can get out there on the open market, well, the New York Giants say sayonara. You take that $10.5 million hit, whether it's 6 this year and 4 next, and you move on with Matt Parrott as your tackle, and you try to sign a swing tackle in free agency. But if they structure the deal in a certain way, you're not going to really affect this year's cap. You could still potentially save some money if you restructure the deal and then structure the new contract in a way that you kind of backload the salary and still give yourself the ability to get out after 2 years. That's the way I see it. It could make financial sense if the New York Giants could set this up in a certain way. But if he's not willing to, restructure his deal, you get rid of him. As always, guys, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe, drop a comment, maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.